Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 in Moravia in the Austrian Empire. It's now part of the Czech Republic. He was the first of 8 children, and when he was 4 years old, his parents moved to Vienna. In 1873, he entered the University of Vienna in order to study medicine. And he worked with some of the best neurophysiologists of the time on the nervous system, Ernst Brücke, Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow, and Joseph Breuer. And his first researches were on the evolution of the nervous system in fish. In 1882, he joined Vienna's General Hospital, but he didn't feel that that was able to give him enough financial stability to get married, which he wanted to do. So after working with Theodor Meinert in his psychiatric clinic, he set up his own private practice in 1886. The year before, he had gone to work for a time with Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris. Charcot was using a new and controversial technique of hypnosis with women suffering from hysteria. The main symptom of hysteria was that the women had some form of physical symptoms, such as a paralysis or a stomachache, which had no apparent physical cause. And Freud was very interested in Charcot's idea that the cause of these physical symptoms was in fact psychological. After a year of traditional psychiatric practice, Freud concluded that the usual cures for hysteria did not work, and so he moved to try Charcot's new method of hypnosis. In this, he was following Bernheim in Nancy and his former collaborator Joseph Breuer in Vienna. In 1892, so 5 years later, he drew to a closer collaboration with Breuer, and 3 years after that, they published their first book together, 1895, Studies in Hysteria. What was groundbreaking about this work was that Freud and Breuer argued that symptoms which were otherwise inexplicable could be explained if we find the psychological causes for them. Now, these causes were themselves not available to the consciousness of the person suffering. So, for instance, a woman called Bertha Pappenheim, who's identified in Studies in Hysteria as Anna O., is reported one summer of having suffered from a terrible thirst, but being unable to drink. And under hypnosis with Breuer, she recalled a time when she had observed an English lady companion, as she described, whom she didn't particularly like, sleeping in a room, and her little dog drank from her glass of water. After recalling this memory in hypnosis, she asked for a glass of water, and then she was able to drink from it, and she woke up from the hypnosis with the glass still in her hand. From that day on, Breuer and Freud report the symptom vanished, never to recur again. So her apparently meaningless inability to drink water, in fact, had a psychological origin in a memory which was surrounded by uncomfortable emotions, her dislike of her English companion, her disgust at the dog, and so on. So originally, Breuer's hypothesis was that the cause of the symptom was a repressed memory. In fact, later on, Freud changed from the emphasis on memories to an emphasis on wishes. Between 1895 and 1900 is when psychoanalysis proper starts. Freud was not particularly good at hypnosis, by his own admission. And so he discovered, again over time through trying it, that in fact it wasn't producing reliable results, that sometimes the symptoms did recur, that the women who were suffering, who were coming to see Freud, were not getting better in the long term. So he replaced hypnosis with what became very famously known as his technique of free association, about which I'll say a little bit more later on. In 1900, he published what he considered his magnum opus, The Interpretation of Dreams, which went through 7 editions during his lifetime. It was a book which he felt always able to own, to come back to develop and refine through the stages of the theory which he developed. And in The Interpretation of Dreams, he puts forward his first big model of the mind involving three systems: the unconscious, the conscious, and the pre-conscious. But 15 years later, the structure started to break down. Freud became unhappy with the way in which he was understanding the mind in these terms. And in a famous paper published in 1914 called On Narcissism, we get the first indications that Freud is unhappy with the way in which he's thought about the unconscious. It just simply doesn't fit the clinical material which he is trying to describe. And then there's a dearth of publications after about 1915. And the next big system that Freud comes out with, the one which he's perhaps most famously known for, is his system of the ego, the id, and the superego, which he published in 1923. Now, at this time, he was 67, so it's not until late on in his life that Freud finally reaches a theoretical, psychological point of view which he's able to maintain. In 1938, Freud moved from Vienna, where he had spent all his life since the age of 4. He moved to London, and then a couple of years later, or a year later, aged 83, he dies. There's much that could be said about Freud's life, about his relationships with his so-called disciples, his difficult relationships with Jung and Adler, for instance, the way in which he fell out with people. That's not going to be my primary concern. I want to discuss Freud, the thinker. But even here, the influence of Freud has been so massive on culture, on literature, on other areas of the humanities and social sciences that we need to narrow down what it is that we will look at. Now, in the way in which he's been taken up in some other studies, in history or in literature, there's something which these studies presuppose, which is that Freud has something meaningful, something insightful to say about the nature of the human mind. And that's the claim that I want to concentrate on. To what extent is Freud's understanding of the structure and operation of the human mind one which can really be defended? What did he have to say? What's the evidence for it? Should we still believe it? He was, after all, engaged in psychology 100 years ago, very close to the birth of that discipline. So I want to have a look at what are the main claims and whether they've stood the test of time. Now, there are really three types of evidence, of thoughts that we might bring to bear on this. One is our everyday experience of living ourselves and with other people around us. The second is what we can call the clinical data, which emerges from the psychoanalytic therapeutic sessions that Freud and psychoanalysts since have performed. And the third I shall refer to is empirical evidence, not because the other forms are not empirical, but just to mean evidence which has been gained through a controlled psychological experiment or through some kind of scientific methodology. Okay, so Freud started as a neuroscientist, so let's start there. In the same year in which he published that book with Breuer, Studies in Hysteria, 1895, Freud drew up a draft which he never intended to publish and indeed tried to suppress. The draft was what he called a project for a scientific psychology. And in it he asked the question, what would psychology look like if we look at it through the lens of brain science? If we look at it, as he says, as something involving forces, involving quantities that we can measure. Now, like neuroscientists at the time, he was very excited by the very recent discovery of the neuron, the cell which makes up the basis of the nervous system. And at this point, people did not know how neurons worked. But Freud decided to construct a speculative hypothesis of how psychology would work if he was right in his theory about how neurons worked. So he's interested in making psychology a natural science. And of course, this is an aim which has remained with us over the last 100 years. So he thought, well, the biological principles which govern the flow of energy through our systems is that of homeostasis. Biological systems like us need to maintain a balance at any time in the way in which we maintain our temperature or our blood sugar levels or so on. So what would be the balance and the kind of thing that needed to be balanced in the brain? That was his question. So he thinks that there will be input of energy into the brain through the form of either stimulation from the outside world, so perception, or again from demands made by the body. So, for instance, hunger would be an obvious one, or again, sexual demands. And Freud thought of these two, the demands to stay alive as an individual organism and the demands to reproduce, as ones which evolution would have selected as the most important functions which would put pressure for work, require responses from the brain. So these levels of energy come into the nervous system, Freud thought, but then, on the principle of homeostasis, something must be done with this energy, with this stimulation. And a lot of work was being done on the reflex at the time that Freud was talking. And the reflex action is very simple, where you get stimulated in some way and you immediately move, such as touching a hot stove or something like that. You immediately feel the heat and you withdraw your hand as quickly as you can. So Freud, like many others at the time, modeled the entire nervous system on the basis of the reflex. The idea was that energy would come in and it would have to be dissipated. And so the aim of the functioning of the neurons is to dissipate energy. If energy builds up in the system, if you have a lot of stimulation, which you then don't do anything about, Freud thought, this would create unpleasure or pain. So he called this basic functioning of the system the unpleasure principle, which later became known by transformation into the pleasure principle, one of the main claims that Freud is very famous for. So the idea was, and this is his thought in 1895, the brain aims to reduce its total amount of energy at any one time, thereby reducing pain within the system, so it's operating according to pleasure. While there was much to recommend this in 1895, even 10 or 11 years